Approximately 466 million years ago, Earth experienced a 20 million year long ice age, during which the temperature cooled by roughly 8 degrees Celsius. This was followed by a 7 million year long warming period. A 2024 paper by Tompkins et al. Hypothesizes that these unusual climactic events, as well as the strange makeup of the equatorial meteor impacts at the time, can be explained by an asteroid roughly the size of the Chicxulub impactor entering Earth's Roche limit. Once there, the object was pulled apart by the planet's gravity. Parts of the disintegrating object would crash into the Earth in the immediate aftermath of the breakup. However, most of the fragmented object would coalesce into a thin, dark ring around the equator, broken up by a small moonlet or a couple. 444 million years ago, the ring began to dissipate as its orbit decayed, finally vanishing altogether about 437 million years ago. KaiPlanet has an excellent video summarizing the paper, as well as explaining why there may be issues with the hypothesis. While I obviously recommend reading the paper itself, watching his video can provide an easily digestible summation of the paper and potential problems with the hypothesis. However, if this hypothesis is correct, this exceedingly rare cosmic event resulted in the Hernantian glaciation and the Late Ordovician Mass Extinction, one of the Big Five. The Late Ordovician Mass Extinction can be best understood as two pulses of extinction, one starting with the glaciation as Earth entered an icehouse climate, and a second pulse as the planet's temperature rose and life that had adapted to the icehouse world was threatened by the return of the hothouse Earth. While there have been icehouse periods since then, indeed we have been in one since the dawn of the Neogene, nothing like this cosmically induced ice age has happened since. But what if it had? What if the meteor that crashed into the Yucatan 66 million years ago had its trajectory altered just a bit? What if instead of plowing into the Earth, the giant space rock had been shredded upon entering Earth's Roche limit, and for the second time in 400 million years, the planet became host to a thin, dark ring? What if the Mesozoic ended in an ice age? Before we can speculate on what kinds of animals might come to dominate an icehouse Paleogene, we should discuss historic glaciations and their impact on Earth. First, let's briefly discuss the various times when dinosaurs may have had an ice age, and what that may have looked like for them. I use the word may because the science is not quite settled on when many of these cold periods occurred and how dramatic they were. We know that climate was, of course, variable throughout the Mesozoic. Even during the hothouse of the Jurassic, there were warmer modes and cooler modes, but pinning down brief glaciations and their causes is far more difficult. Nothing as dramatic or as sustained as the Hernantian glaciation or the Neogene icehouse is proposed to have taken place during the Mesozoic. However, that doesn't mean the era was universally warm. One of these ephemeral cooling modes occurred during the late Aptian and early Albian stages of the early Cretaceous, characterized by cooling at the poles and aridification around Europe and Patagonia. This cold snap appears to have had the brunt of its impact felt on ocean life and flora, as it contributed to the expansion of angiosperm diversity prior to the start of the angiosperm terrestrial revolution. However, the cast of land animals was not totally unaffected, as groups that had long been in decline, like the stegosaurs and the mammaliomorph tritylodontids, appear to have gone extinct. Both of these infirm groups of herbivores were potentially pushed over the edge by the floral mass extinction, which was caused by the cold snap. Stegosaurs may have survived the cold snap on the more equatorial island continent of India, but the last of the mainland Asian members of the clade look to have finally been driven extinct. Though this cooling mode was relatively minor, and the mass extinction it resulted in was far less dramatic than cooling events that characterized the Cenozoic, it does demonstrate how even a more subdued cooling trend can dramatically alter life for vulnerable species. Moving on from the cooling modes of the Mesozoic to the more dramatic glaciations that this theoretical end Cretaceous ice age would more likely resemble, It is obviously tempting to reference the Late Ordovician extinction, given that you'd expect to see similar results from a similar event. Much of the devastation in the first pulse of the extinction came from the retreat of the shallow seas as huge volumes of water were frozen into glacial ice around the poles. You could expect similar extinctions to occur in the shallow seas of the Maastrichtian-Paleocene transitional period as glaciers advance. The dwindling western interior seaway would likely vanish entirely and not have the same sort of Paleocene bounce back it did in our world with the growth of the Cannonball Sea during the mid-Paleocene biotic event. This climate event saw a significant temperature spike, similar to, though less extreme than the later Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. However, we'll get back to the MPB and PETM later. Instead, we'll look at the shallow seas dividing the European archipelago from Asia. While the Mediterranean Tethys is unlikely to dry out entirely, you would expect to see the seas dividing Britain and Greenland from the bulk of the European mainland to vanish. Similarly, the western Siberian Sea separating Asia from Europe is likely to disappear, with the Paratethys shrinking into something more akin to the historic Paratethys as the straits connecting it to the Mediterranean Tethys vanish. The North African inland seas would suffer a similar fate, turning the vast inland waterways, which once hosted an enormous variety of life, into dried-out lowlands. The impact of these marine regressions would devastate marine fauna. Giant mosasaurs, only having recently supplanted the giant pliosaurs, will likely be driven to extinction. Nothing akin to these titanic ocean-going lizards lived during the Ordovician. However, parallels can be drawn between the mosasaurs and their mammalian successors, the basilosaurid whales. Perhaps the extinction event that can be best used to help understand what a Maastrichtian-Paleocene glaciation event might look like is the first glaciation of our Cenozoic, the Grand Coupure. While the Late Ordovician extinction can inform us on how the general patterns of extinction might play out and provide insights into the impact on shallow sea ecologies, the Grand Coupure can show us how terrestrial fauna and marine megafauna succumbed to or overcame the abrupt transition from a global greenhouse climate to our icehouse world. The basilosaurs, which had once been the uncontested rulers of the Eocene oceans, fielding giant predators like Basilosaurus and titanic benthic feeders like Parasitus, vanished in the geological blink of an eye with the glaciation of Antarctica that signaled the transition from the Eocene to the Oligocene. Similarly, while smaller mosasaurines could plausibly survive the disruption of the ocean's food web, the halosaurines, with their more primitive flippers and poor adaptations for surviving in open ocean environments, would likely vanish. Tylosaurines, though occurring in pelagic chalk, were not the best swimmers. These titanic ambush predators would likely not survive the climate chaos. Similarly, the giant Mosasaurini will not survive the MPGE. Titans like Hoffman's mosasaur would simply be unable to cope with that level of disruption and ecological collapse. However, just as not all whales went extinct with the basilosaurs, there are several mosasaur clades that had a strong possibility of surviving the MPGE. The prognathodontans, with their generalist but pelagic-leaning lifestyle, and mosasaurids like Plotosaurus, with their more derived body plan that allowed for sustained tail-driven locomotion, were probably the two groups best positioned to survive the oceanic mass extinction and radiate into ever more derived species during the period of recovery. The Grand Coupure of our world wreaked havoc on populations of both benthic foraminifera and phytoplankton, causing collapses of food webs and the extinction of roughly 35% of all ocean life. The significantly more intense cooling trend of the MPGE would likely result in an even greater loss of life, reducing the diverse mosasaurs down to just two clades. One of the other groups likely devastated by the bottom falling out of the food web would be the Ammonites. It was once commonly believed that this ancient group had been in decline prior to the K-Pg. However, a 2024 paper on late Cretaceous ammonoid diversity fairly conclusively shows that this was not the case. The ammonites had healthy and regionally distinct levels of species diversity across the globe, which was all snuffed out by the K-Pg. Here, we leave the Grand Coupure behind for a moment as a reference point and return to the loam as a frame of reference. Anoxic ocean conditions caused by the rapid creation of glaciers, the collapse of planktonic productivity, and the significant reduction of sea levels all worked together to devastate cephalopod diversity during the loam. However, during both the loam and the Grand Coupure, deep-water shelled cephalopods weathered the climate disaster fairly well, protected to a degree from the climate shock by more consistent ocean temperatures. It can be expected that while many of the ammonoids would likely be driven extinct during the MPGE, those surviving in the deep water refugia would be perfectly positioned to radiate out of this niche once the new Ice Age climate had stabilized. While discussing mosasaurs, ammonites, and benthic foraminifera is certainly not a comprehensive look at the impact the MPGE might have on Maastrichtian ocean ecosystems, it shows us how different trophic levels would likely react to the event and gives us a good notion of the severity. Though the loss of life would be extreme, it's plausible that, just as was the case with the loam, many of the animals driven extinct during the chaos would have their niches filled not by entirely new organisms radiating into vacant niches, but clades of fairly closely related animals. This is not to say that there wouldn't be new secondarily aquatic animals invading the shallow seas of this Ice Age Paleogene. There almost certainly would. But they would not be stepping into an ocean where the slate had been totally wiped clean. Think more mosasaurs entering the oceans after the Cenomanian-Turonian anoxic event had devastated the pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs, rather than whales entering the oceans after the K-Pg had wiped the slate clean of the ocean-going reptiles. The next entry in this, hopefully, two-part exercise will look more at the impact on terrestrial fauna, and then propose what life might be like 10 million years after the extinction event.
Thank you guys for liking and subscribing. The Q&A should be coming out very soon. It was originally supposed to come out before this one, but I had some major audio issues that are kind of even worse than the ones that were present in this video. Anyways, thank you, and I hope to see you guys real soon.